Well, then let me be the first to formally welcome Karol Mason back to Carolina virtually, unfortunately, at this point. My name is Andrew Perrin. I'm a professor of sociology here at Carolina, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, which is, of course, simply the best place on campus. And what we are seeking to do in the context of the COVID pandemic is to find ways to make the conversations that we always try to host so well here at Hyde Hall, trying to make sure those conversations continue, and in some cases are even better because of the ways that we can bring them online and bring them back to our various communities that we serve. So we're thrilled then to welcome a friend of the Institute, an alumna of Carolina, and an amazing scholar and human being and leader, Karol Mason, to today's IAH Zoom talk. Before I introduce President Mason, let me begin just by setting a few ground rules for our conversation. I've asked Karol Mason to give us a presentation, and her discussion is on where do we go from here? What can each of us do to create a more perfect union? And the questions that we'll be asking are fundamentally humanistic questions. They're questions about how do we function, how do we work as human beings in a world, particularly now, that has been so thrown into turmoil by all the events of what we're just going to end up calling 2020. We don't even need to list all the pieces that have made this such a tumultuous year. Following that presentation, we'll have an open question and answer and comment section. We do ask, if you can, please to leave your camera on so that the conversational style that we expect or that we try to develop here at the Institute can work. Obviously, if there's a reason you can't, feel free to leave it off. Please leave your microphone muted unless and until you're asking a question of the speaker. Once we do get to the question and answer session, the easiest thing to do is to post your question or your request to ask a question in the chat, in the public chat, and then we will call upon you to ask your question. You can also use the hand raise feature if you prefer that in Zoom. We will be recording this session, and the session video will be posted to our website at iah.unc.edu. So you'll be able to come back and take a look at the conversation today. It is therefore my pleasure to go ahead and introduce Karol Mason, the president of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, part of the City University of New York system. President Mason has been a legal pioneer. She's been an exceptional voice for equality. She was an assistant attorney general and head of the Department of Justice's Office of Justice Programs. And she's been, she received her bachelor's in math from North Carolina as a lifelong Tar Heel, and a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. She's been a member of the UNC Board of Trustees, and she's been a wonderful friend to the Institute for the Arts and Humanities as well. A true leader in academic and justice work. We're thrilled to welcome Karol Mason, and looking forward first to her presentation and then to a wonderful conversation. President Mason.
So it's Karol. Thank you for, it's wonderful to be back home, even if it's just virtually in Chapel Hill. As some of you know, I have a place in Chapel Hill that I unfortunately have not been able to visit in person because I don't want to go through a 2-week quarantine when I come back to New York. So please take care of Chapel Hill for me. So when Andrew first, I know you all call him Andy, but I'm more comfortable saying Andrew right now. First introduced this idea in June. I knew we would still be in this environment, and it's a wonderful way to connect. So he left the topic up to me. Danger for him. But as the summer progressed, things began to crystallize about what I wanted an opportunity to talk with you about, and the emphasis is on talk with you about it. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A session, because that's how how I process and how I grow and how I learn is through conversation with people and debating ideas and thinking through these tough issues. So when for me, and I'm going to talk about how this period we're in has impacted me, and then how organizationally I'm choosing to figure out how to move forward, and then a challenge for you all about how I think you all can all move forward in what we're calling this moment. So we started with COVID. As I said before we started, I have the distinction of being the first of many things. I was the first Black woman to make partner at a major firm in the South, the first Black woman to chair a management committee of a IAM Law 100 law firm. I'm the first woman and the first woman of color to be the president of John Jay. Unfortunately, I also have the distinction of having the first confirmed positive COVID case. We didn't even have the word COVID at that time. The first confirmed novel coronavirus case in the CUNY system on March 10th. And that changed our world. Our students and our faculty have not been back on campus since March 10th. And then what I learned during this experience and during this pivotal moment in transitioning is what we've all learned, is that this disease, at least in its initial stages, and I think it's still holding true, disproportionately impacts communities of color and poor communities. And that is the definition of the John Jay population. That is the definition of the CUNY population. John Jay is a majority minority institution. Over 75% of my students are of color, with over 50% being Latinx, Hispanic, and the next largest number being African American. And they also are poor, and the majority are the first in their families to go to college. Now, we share some things with Carolina in terms of that Carolina's mission is to make education opportunities available and accessible to all North Carolinians. And I am proud to have learned so much about access from my experience at Carolina. But as my provost reminds me regularly when I say that I'm the product of all public institutions my entire life, I've never been to a private school of any sort. He reminds me that in terms of my higher education experience, that I'm used to elite private experience. And so learning how to pivot in that environment to the things that I learned at Chapel Hill to the John Jay environment, it's very different. So we had students who live in multi-generational houses, one of my presidential interns, everyone in his household, from his grandmother to his parents to him and his siblings, were positive for COVID. I keep a supply of condolence cards, and I use them all up within the first 2 weeks, because we had that many deaths in the John Jay family, either family members, mainly family members, not our students themselves. But that is a really powerful experience to realize that you're trying to provide this opportunity in the midst of students whose lives are greatly impacted in ways that I am not positioned to always address. So that was the first thing that this COVID started revealing, and I hope, shining a light on the inequities across our country, and how our healthcare systems, our educational systems, our systems are disproportionately not serving those who are most in need. Then the George Floyd situation happened. And I tell people that tomorrow I'm going to be 63, so I give myself freedom to tear up when I tear up. I'm not embarrassed by it. But the George Floyd killing, because that's what you have to call it, happened. And for me, that was extremely personal on multiple levels. It's because, as Andrew mentioned, when I headed up the Office of Justice Programs at the Department of Justice, and one of the things that we did was I cobbled together enough money to create something called the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, because in the wake of the Trayvon Martin situation, before Michael Brown happened, I realized that we had this distrust between communities of color in particular and law enforcement, and in order to have a fully functioning justice system, we needed to address that. So right after Michael Brown happened in Ferguson, Missouri, the Attorney General announced this initiative, and we had 6 pilot sites, the goal of which was to prevent a Michael Brown situation from ever happening again. And guess who was one of our pilot sites? Minneapolis. So I spent millions of dollars, hundreds of hours, investment in Minneapolis to make sure a Michael Brown situation never happened. And instead we have something that achieved the goal of having universal consensus from law enforcement and everybody watching that that kind of behavior was unacceptable, reprehensible, criminal. And so for me, after having spent that time making sure that everybody, whether they were sworn officer or civilian employee of the Minneapolis Police Department, received procedural justice training, they received implicit bias training, and they went through a racial reconciliation process, and this still happened. So for me, you know, Joe, you asked, how do you deal with when your students ask you how you're doing and you've had a horrible day? Well, George Floyd happened. The world was upended in terms of being able to just realize that there are some problems this country has got to finally deal with. I'm the president of an institution, but I am also a Black woman with nephews, with brothers, with friends who could have been George Floyd and who had invested so much time in making sure that didn't happen in Minneapolis. And I was president of a community that expected me to lead and to have a response from an institution who was founded as a police college and is grounded in justice, social justice. And I didn't put out a campus-wide statement for a week, which caused all kinds of uproar because I needed time to process personally before I could be presidential and respond. So, which caused a lot of angst with my students who were ready to protest because they didn't hear from me, they hadn't heard my voice. But I used it as a learning opportunity, and I wrote the statement myself. My team wanted to write it for me. I said, no, I need to write this one. And I say this to say that we've got to reveal our own vulnerabilities and our own struggles when we're dealing with people and addressing these issues. They've got to know that this is important to us personally. It's not just a theoretical issue. And so I responded and let them know, and then met with the Black students in particular who were ready to picket and protest because they hadn't heard from me. And I explained to them the why. And the second lesson in that is to the people who are angry with you and upset with you, meet with them, talk with them, lay out your vulnerability, apologize, and have a conversation. And so where we are now is that, again, I said John Jay was created in the 1950s, excuse me, 1964, 65, 50 plus years ago, as a police college, because someone had the foresight to understand that law enforcement officers ought to have a grounding in liberal arts, which I know will resonate with this group, in order to better equip them and inform them to be better partners in the communities in which they are there to serve. And I think those are important words, is understanding that they are public servants and they are there to serve and be partners with their community. And so for me, as the president of John Jay, I see this moment in time as an opportunity as well as a crisis. I know that the Chinese symbol for opportunity, they say, in crisis are similar. But, you know, we all talk about this as a moment. And so what I hope that we don't do is, I hope that that moment means that this is a pivotal time where there's going to be market change on the other side of this moment. And I hope when we use the word moment, we're not using this as it's temporary, because at 63 almost years old, I don't want to go through this again. And those of you who are younger than us, I'm saying us, younger than me and John and Joe, I don't want you to have to go through this again in 50 years, but you will if we don't address this and get it right this time. And what does that mean by get it right? I think it means that you've got to figure out what your individual role is in looking at what's happening in America, what has happened in America, and how you're going to use your voice and your position and your privilege to change it. Now, every single one of us, regardless of our color, on this call, participating in this conversation, has privilege. I just want that to sink in. You all have privilege. Even though you may not see it, you have it. Some of us, some of you, have more privilege than others. simply because of the color of your skin. And so one of the things I think that's important for us to think about in these conversations is we've got to realize that when we talk about systemic racism, we're not calling anyone a racist, but we are looking at our systems and looking what our systems were doing, designed to do, and how they're functioning and the long-term consequences. So in this notion of thinking about how do we create a more perfect union and what is our role and responsibility in living up to the ideals on which this country was founded, even though when those documents were written, my ancestors were not the people they thought about when they were creating this more perfect union, but we have gotten to a place, thankfully, in America where we're all included in that language now as equally. But we've got to, again, think about and understand and know the history of what happened that causes us to be in the situation we're in today. So one of the things I'll talk about what I'm doing in terms of seizing this opportunity, and it falls on multiple levels in terms of what to do. We all feel a sense of powerlessness sometimes when you're watching the news, and when I watch the different camera angles they keep discovering about the George Floyd situation, I sit there and I go, I can't take another one. And you have to realize we're going through trauma. We're experiencing real trauma watching these things. And some of us, it's a different kind of trauma because we are also Black people or people of color. But every time a new one comes on, I go, I can't watch it, but I know I have to watch it because I have to see it. And and I have this sense of powerlessness. And when what happened in Minneapolis, what I said to the young folks was, I felt like I had failed because I made all this investment in Minneapolis and it still happened. Then I got a grip, got a hold of myself, and I didn't fail. We didn't fail. It just didn't work. It just demonstrated how hard this work is, how hard systemic change is, how hard cultural change is, and reinforced that we've got to stay at it. We stay at it, stay at it. So how am I addressing this in my organization? And how am I seizing this as an opportunity and seeing this as an opportunity? Again, start with educating yourself. I can give you a bibliography of things to read, which I recommend. Read, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. Read The Color of Law. These are important documents to help us understand and get a grounding in how what happened 400 years ago and has continued, it didn't stop, continued through our laws that have created the situation we're in today. One of the things I did organizationally is yesterday, I have a 55-person, what I call President's Leadership Council, that includes not just administrative folks, but the faculty leadership and the student leadership, because I didn't want a cabinet. I wanted to create an environment where everybody's talking and sharing and really communicating. So I created a President's Leadership Council, and I put everybody through the phase 1 2-day workshop with the Racial Equity Institute based there in Greensboro. I finished my session yesterday, and it was, and I think I'm fairly well educated. I'm not a scholar, I'm a consumer of scholarship. I want to, and I hope that we all become consumers of scholarship that's out there, because the information's out there. But the way the Racial Equity Institute, they call it REI, I think the Outdoor Outfitters when I hear that, but the way that they put together the history in a way that you could see to connect all the dots and go, aha, I recommend it, or I recommend something like it, so that you can begin to understand how the laws starting in 1619 through the laws we have today have been designed to marginalize people of color. That's why we call it systemic racism, because they were designed to systematically advantage people who were white for many reasons, primarily economic reasons, but the systems were designed to help those who were in power, financially and politically, to retain that power. And until we understand that, we can't understand why we're here today. and why we're in the situation we're in today. That doesn't make anyone bad. It's just a reflection of what the system has done, what the law has done that creates the situation we're in today. So they use this analogy of the fish, the lake, and the groundwater. And the fish is, we're all trying to figure out how to solve the problem of the fish. And so that has been my focus. And that they use this analogy about, you see a fish and you try to figure out why that, fix that fish. And she used this image of hundreds of fish in the lake just dead. And they said, when you see that, you don't think what's wrong with the fish, you think what's wrong with the lake, what's wrong with the water. The interesting thing about the analogy they chose to use, I walk every morning. I'm in my 22nd week of walking most mornings of the week, unless it's raining or I have an really early start. And one day I was walking along the Hudson River and I saw hundreds of dead fish. And I thought, something is wrong here. And I called, I did call and try to find out what was wrong, and try to figure out what the systemic issue was that caused all those fish to die. And that's what they're trying to get us to think about, is what are the systemic issues that are leading to the disparities and the inequalities that we see in our system. Even before this training, I'm on the Southern Poverty Law Center board, and we've been thinking about our mission statement and our strategic plan. And one of the things that I think is important for all of us, no matter what position you have, but particularly those of you who are in academia, is to stop thinking of the people we want to help as they have a problem, and to begin thinking about what is the system's problem that is causing them to be in this situation. And so for me, the REI training was validation of that thinking, because my students, I'd put my students up against the students at Carolina every day, any day. They are so talented, they're so smart, but the system and the systems and the circumstances in which they're living do not allow them to be able to shine the same way that students at Harvard or Yale have opportunities and resources. And so we've got to, so at the end of the training, I sat there and I thought about, people, they wanted us to get thinking about the systems change, but you can't separate the systems change from dealing with the individual in front of you too. So it's a multifaceted challenge that we have. And so I'm still going to be focused on my students, the fish, and their success. But I also need to take some steps back and think about what are the systematic impediments that impede their ability to succeed. And so for me, step one for all of us in terms of what can we do is get educated, understand why we are where we are, and educate yourself in a way of not thinking about assessing blame, because this is not a blame game. This is how do we learn and how do we change, and understanding that something that's taken 400 years to be where it is, it's actually more than 400 years. When you think about, the nice thing about, for me, I am fortunate that in many ways that I grew up in this Black skin with parents who made sure I understood the history of my people. Then I had the advantage of going to the Department of Justice and doing a lot of work with tribal nations, and got steeped in understanding the history of how America intentionally tried to annihilate Native Americans and or force their assimilation. So I got steeped in understanding the history of Native Americans' experience in this country and with our laws. And then now being in an Hispanic serving institution, being steeped in understanding how America has dealt with people from Mexico, from Puerto Rico, and understanding how all these histories have a lot of commonality. And so I say that I have that advantage because then I can be able to understand how we are where we are. And again, seeing the consistency in what has happened to marginalize people who were not white or European. And that's another issue for another conversation about the whole construct of race in America and how we've come to define these terms. I said to my boss, I said, race is just a social construct created here in America. And they said, yes, but that social construct has done a lot of damage and continues to do a lot of damage. But we've got to understand it and figure out how do we navigate it and move within it. But then so in part of educating yourself, then the next step to me is the organizations in which you operate, because all of us operate within some organizational structure. Whether you're retired or not, you're still in some organizational structure of some sort. Is how do you help your organizational structure understand what's happening and why we are where we are? And then, and again, so that's why I put my whole leadership team through this REI training, so that we have some common language and a common framework from which to figure out how do we move forward and how do we address these issues. And the more people that we have across this country who have a common understanding of why we are where we are, I think that enables us to have, again, a common language, a common understanding, a common framework from which to work. And all of us are citizens of some community. And so the question is, how do you use that voice? How do you use your privilege? How do you use your individual power within those communities in which you operate? And it's more than voting. It's showing up, it's getting engaged and getting involved. So again, I'll talk about what I personally have done and how within that framework that I'm engaging and trying to figure out how do we address this pivotal time so that on the other side of this, it's better. Because I will tell you that this is a gut-wrenching time for me as somebody of color who lived through this in the 60s and 70s and thought we'd left this behind, and we're going through it again in a way that we cannot avoid seeing because of social media now. So again, I educated my team. And whenever anybody calls me to speak, I say yes. It means I don't sleep much. It means that I'm dependent on that daily walk because that's how I keep my sanity. But there are mayors who I can't name that I'm advising quietly behind the scenes to try to figure out how to help them through this. But what I'm doing using my platform as the president of John Jay, the president of what was a police college, is I raised the money to create a national dialogue and conversation about what does public safety mean. So we've got all this challenging conversation happening now where people are talking about defunding the police, abolishing the police. And I said, I want to use my leadership position to help people through these conversations. So I said, we're going to start with thinking about reimagining public safety. What does public safety look like? What does it mean when we say public safety, and who contributes to public safety? And all of these questions are going to ask in the contest. And then what does that mean for policing? Where should investments be made? And then what does that mean for policing? At the end of the day, shortly after Thanksgiving, I want to come out with a paper that says, here are the common, where we find common consensus on certain issues around public safety and what does that mean for policing, and to give people a roadmap for their own communities to have these kinds of conversations. Because one of the things that I hope we all have learned or learning is that none of us can just dictate the solution to communities. We've got to hear from the people who are impacted directly. Brian Stevenson always talks about you got to be proximate to the problem. You have got to hear from the individuals who we want to help to hear what they need. And so, and that's, you know, in the framework of a higher educational institution, that means really deeply engaging and hearing from students, really deeply engaging and hearing from faculty, really deeply engaging and hearing from staff about what they need for the institution. For those of us in our communities, it means who want to help our communities on a more local level, it means being in community conversations, get engaged with people on the grassroots level and hear what it is they think they need and what they want, so that you can begin thinking about where the system changes and policy changes that need to be made. And it's important to hear from them. I'll give you an example from my own personal experience, and I think I need to stop in a second. When I was head of OJP, we did a lot of work with children of incarcerated parents. And I had the misconception that the children of incarcerated parents, they weren't, what kind of guidance and role models were they getting from their parents who are incarcerated? But when I sat and listened and had the conversation with the children, I learned that that's their mom and dad, regardless of the circumstances of where they are, they still need their parents. And that changed my whole framework and my whole way of engaging in the work and trying to make sure that I created programs so that parents could stay connected to their children. That was why we started making sure that we could that we found a way around the prohibition of using federal Department of Education money for Pell Grants for people who are incarcerated, because we know that education benefits not only the people who are incarcerated, but their children as well. So I say this to say that you've got to stay engaged and really listen to people and talk to people and find out where they think that you could make a difference. So for me, the way that we create this more perfect union is we've got to use our power, we've got to use our privilege, we've got to use our voices. You can't just think this is someone else's problem. Investing financial resources in where the need is great. As an institution that is woefully underfunded with huge needs, I depend on philanthropy. I wish I had a fraction of Carolina's endowment. I mean, like a minute fraction of it would be phenomenal at John Jay, but that's not enough. You've got to really roll up your sleeves and dig in and engage. Find the way that works for you. That what works for me isn't going to work for everybody, but you've got to engage. As the former head of the COPS office, Ron Davis, said in a convening that we did in Minneapolis recently, he said the only unacceptable response is silence or violence. And so, and speaking up doesn't mean that you have to be in the streets protesting. But it does mean that you've got to use your voice, use your power, use your privilege to think about how you help other people, help this country live up to the ideals on which it was founded. So I think I'm over 20 minutes and we're supposed to do Q&A.
Karol, thank you. That was a terrific, provocative, thoughtful set of comments, and I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation coming up. I am going to take the privilege, actually, you mentioned using our privilege. I'm going to take the privilege, actually, of throwing out the first question. Mm-hmm. And I'm intrigued, as you know, here at IAH, we're a scholarship organization. We are working to advance Carolina's faculty scholarship. And you mentioned, I thought that the phrase you used was really neat. You said you're a consumer of scholarship. Mm-hmm. What would be most helpful to know? What would be most helpful in this process for the amazing humanistic and artistic scholars at Carolina to help discover in the kinds of work that you're doing in your world?
So I think, one of the things that I have found really helpful to me, again, as I said, I've had the advantage of now being in an Hispanic serving institution, and our faculty have had a series of lectures in the evening that are open to everybody, and I always go to things like this to understand the history of race in America. And so, for example, when we had the westward movement, and we learned it in school as manifest destiny. It sounds very noble, but then when you dig underneath and find out what really happened, it means you stole the land from Native Americans, displaced them and relocated them, and then gave out their land for nominal cost to people who were white, Europeans. When you went further west, it was occupied by Mexico, and decided to go to war with Mexico, won. And the part of Mexico that we took, rich in resources, California, Nevada, New Mexico, parts of Utah, Arizona. And what I learned from the history is, so, as they say, to the winner of the war goes the spoils. But the US was very intentional about where they drew the line of which part of Mexico they took. They took the part of Mexico where there were only about 100,000 inhabitants, left the part of Mexico where there were millions of inhabitants. Had they taken those millions into the population, it would have shifted America from being a predominantly white country to being a predominantly brown country. These are things we need to understand as part of our history and why we are where we are. And so I encourage you to be able to open the scholarship beyond the traditional European approach to history and hearing the history from the perspectives of impacted communities. There's lots of literature out there from Native American scholars, African American scholars, Mexican American scholars about the history of what happened in creation of America that is different from what I learned in school and probably what most of you learned in school about manifest destiny. And it's important to understand that for a number of reasons. So I didn't want to get too deep into it, but when you read The Color of Law, you'll understand this too. But when you look at, so in the early years when they took the land from Native Americans, they sold acreage at nominal amounts. Then the next go around, they allowed that money to be paid in installments. And then in the arrangement with the land that was Mexico, they actually gave it away free with the understanding that you'd stay there and live there for 5 years. So you have European Americans who have the opportunity to build wealth that's passed on generationally. That doesn't happen for people of color. It was taken from them. And then you have moving into the more current 20th century history, where after World War II, and they started allowing GIs to come home and encouraging them to build homes and get an education, those opportunities were not available to people of color. Mm-hmm. So the home ownership and the loans for home ownership it was written into the law. You could not give the loan to somebody of color to move into a white community. It was illegal. So we don't have the opportunity to have built wealth from those houses that people bought in the 40s and 50s, then accumulated equity and passed on generational wealth. And that's why we see intergenerational poverty in people of color. So I encourage you to really look at the law and challenge our traditional conceptions of the history that we've been taught. And Carolina can do that.
Thank you. We have a question from Gail Henderson. Gail, do you want to jump in, or you want me to read the message?
Yeah, I can. Hi. I appreciate so much your conversation with us. I'm in the School of Medicine in the Department of Social Medicine. I don't believe we've met, but I like at least meeting this way. I'm also sorry I took my Zoom off.
Oh, I was going to say, I can't see you, but now I can see you. Nice to meet you.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm just so distressed with people who are just sort of screaming that they're afraid of defund the police. So, and that's a point, and I guess was imagining what you would say, what you have said in those kinds of situations. And that's along the lines of what so many people are thinking about now, creating a more perfect union, meeting people and sort of bridging gaps and chasms that I don't really think can be bridged, but have to be. So it was a very simple question, but what do you say when people are most worried that somehow what you're doing or what we're doing is going to result in defunding police? I mean, that is that phrase itself is so fraught that, but in any case, I would just love to hear your comments.
So first I want to say thank you for we're using the word chasm, because we keep talking about these gaps, inequities. They're not gaps. As somebody said to me, a gap is something you could step over. These are chasms. And so you're right. But so that's, first I would encourage them to come join the conversations that John Jay and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, will be hosting. But what people are really saying when they say defund the police is they're asking you to rethink where you're investing. And that's why I decided I wanted to reframe the conversation and not put the focus on policing, but put the focus on public safety, and getting everyone to then take a breath and have a conversation about, what does public safety look like to me? What are the ingredients and components of public safety to me? And then where do I need to make investments in order to have that? Because everybody will agree that there are times when you need law enforcement. You know, if somebody's holding me up at gunpoint, I want a law enforcement officer. But the question is, and law enforcement will tell you this as well, they've been asked to step in the breach and do things that are not traditional law enforcement, where if we'd made investments earlier in education, in job creation, in health, in mental health, it would minimize the times when police are called in to deal with things that aren't policing issues. That's one thing. But then on the flip side of it, I think that we've also got to think about the role of policing, who we're bringing into policing. And there are a lot of success stories where policing, you know, what I'm trying to educate our generation of officers coming out of John Jay is with a public health and social work kind of perspective. They are partners with the community. They are problem solvers. They're not, you know, that era when we used to recruit people into policing with, you know, the kind of SWAT videos, like in recruiting from the military. Not saying recruiting from the military is bad, but you've got to recruit with a mindset of, what is it we want you to do? We want you to be a partner with the community. So I think that what you've got to do is, people get caught up in the rhetoric, and I try not to use the words defund or abolish, except when I'm using them as examples here, because that isn't really the question. That's not really what people are wrestling with. They're wrestling with, how are you going to invest in creating a safe community where all of us have an opportunity to thrive? Because we all have the same goals for our children. You know, I remember being in a seminar early on and hearing some from Annie Casey Foundation saying that when we're looking at school success issues and juvenile issues and keeping young people out of the juvenile system, they're like, the goals that we measure shouldn't be how many people aren't going into detention. The goals and measures ought to be the same for your students, your children. What kind of A's are you getting? What kind of opportunities you're getting? And so everybody wants the same kind of opportunity for their children. And the question is, how do we assure that? Or how do we maximize that possibility in making these investments? And I'm going to say something really heretical. I think we need to be prepared to pay some more taxes. I think we've gone through too long of people not wanting to make investments in our communities. You know, I'm starting with California and all that, you know, they're not taxing, and they're suffering the results of that because you don't have the resources you need to do the things you need to do. So I think it's a question of being able to have those kind of community conversations. And that's one of the things that will be the byproduct of what I'm planning to produce out of these conversations, is a roadmap for people to have these kind of conversations in their communities. I hope that answers your question.
I'll say. Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in. Carol, it's Michael.
I know, and Michael, I was going to say, when I say I try not to say no to people, you asked for a day, I wasn't available.
I wasn't going to call you out on that. So
I was going to.
So anyway, so Carol, it's great to see you. And as you know, and Andy will attest to, we had a very successful series, 2 events here in Atlanta to talk about racism, but I didn't really want to talk necessarily about that. But we are in a period of time for the next few months. It's just going to be so much noise as we work through all the elections. And I think you and I haven't been part of the previous administration. You know, obviously, I think we're optimistic that Vice President Biden will prevail. And I think if that is in fact the case, which is still an assumption at this point, but I do think that we'll have the opportunity to start to create a different culture going forward. And I guess the question that I would pose to you is, so let's assume that he does win and starts to put the right people in place. What can we do once we get to the other side as individuals to continue to work to instill a lot of what we've learned? A lot of people on the call have been spending a lot of time learning about issues pertaining to racism. And now people are struggling with, okay, now that I've got some of this knowledge, what do I do with it? Where do I go? Things of that nature. And I think you pointed out some things that you've been doing, but as individuals, what can people do? One of the things that came out of our discussions in Atlanta was that I asked people to, if there are situations where they see discrimination or racism going on, to call it out, particularly if they're white alums, to call it out and help people out, people of color out, who may be in a situation where they're under attack. But do you have any sort of thoughts to the group about what individuals can do, assuming we get to the other side and the climate in the country, at least from a political standpoint, changes?
So I would say that regardless of who's in charge in the White House, most issues are local. And so I'll answer by telling a story. So when I was fortunate enough to be in the Department of Justice, we had federal leadership on a lot of these issues. But once we lost that federal leadership, I said that doesn't mean that the work has to stop. And we need to realize, again, the power that we have. And most of these issues, 99% of the issues are state and local issues. And we need to remember that the federal leadership is nice. Federal convening power is nice in setting the tone but that's not where the real work can and should happen. So some of you who know me know this. In January 20th at noon, I became unemployed in 2017. Hadn't even submitted, I'd put off the headhunter talking to me about John Jay. Hadn't talked to anybody about John Jay yet. Didn't know I was going to where I was going to work. But in March, I saw one too many email messages about what the Department of Justice was doing on criminal justice issues. So I pulled together my network and started saying, okay, federal leadership is nice, but we don't need it. We need to keep this work going on a state and local level about criminal justice reform issues. So we started convening a conference to make sure that people understood we have the power to keep this work going. Didn't have a job. Fortunately, I got the job at John Jay, so I was able to say, we'll host it at John Jay, and we've done it for 4 years now. And people are hungry to be part of a solution. And so my answer to people is, don't wait for a change in the White House. Do the work now. Do you go to your city council meetings? Do you talk to your mayor? Do you talk to your police chief? Do you talk to your school superintendent? Or do you talk to your religious leaders about where you can make a difference? And everybody can do something. You don't have to wait for people to guide you to the solution. Go raise your hand. Go find where you think your skills can be most used and engage in the conversation. But I share your optimism that we will have some different federal leadership. And I hope that they will then begin to support some of this work, but we shouldn't be dependent. I used to say when I used to have money, I used to tell people when I had a $4 billion purse, will you know me when I no longer have it? And what I would say at people who were arguing with me and fussing with me about what I wasn't doing, though I'd like to have them see now, what do you have to say to me about what I wasn't doing before? But I think it's important to remember that there's a limit to what the federal government can do. That's good depending on who's in power and bad depending on who's in power. But the truth is, there's still a limit to what the federal government can do. It can help shape policy by how it distributes money, but the use of the money happens on the state and local level, and that's where the power is, and that's where we've got to remember that we've got that power and use it.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question before we wrap up, and Keturah Parker has her hand up. Would you like to join in with a question?
She's looking for her mute button.
Yeah, there we go. Sure, and it's more of a statement than a question. And first I want to just say thank you so much, Karol, for your talk this morning. I mean, clearly it is timely, and what you said has resonated a great deal. One of the resounding messages that you commented on was engaging deeply and directly, with the community to determine their needs, such that the approach is not to invite them to our table, but to come to their table, to discuss, what resources are needed to begin making meaningful change. And with that said, I'm very pleased to share that Carolina has created, and you may have heard about it, Southern Futures Initiative. And it is striving to accomplish this very thing. And the partners are the College of Arts and Sciences and the Center for the Study of American South and the University Libraries and CPA. And that mission is to bring our public resources to the communities, to people, and cultivate that vibrant scholarship that is right here on our campus. So I just wanted to share that and to thank you again so much for bringing light to these really, really critical issues.
So I want to get more, I know you know how to find me. I want to get more information about that, because one of the things that I hope that you all know from Carolina is you are my rich resource bank for ideas, because you've been at this a lot longer than John Jay and CUNY have. So the funny thing is, yesterday in REI training, they were asking us a question about, to prove a point about somebody had to come up, dig up the information about the resources at Carolina versus A&T. Well, I know that those answers by heart because I'm part of this community. But I learn a lot from you all that I then take to help other communities. So please continue to share the work that you all do. The whole Covenant Scholars Program, I remember when that started, and now everybody's copying that. These are things where you want to be copied, you want to be replicated. So please continue to be innovative and creative and sharing those ideas, because we all need them.
Well, Carol, I'm Caroline Williamson. I live in New York also.
Oh.
And our church is doing a lot of this work. And oddly enough, our rector is a UNC graduate, former Moorhead and president of the school, Matt Hyde. And we've got a moonshot group that's looking on how we can rebuild New York City. And we're doing a lot of work with reconciliation, the justice system, the Fund for the Not Forgotten, a lot of people. And we'd love to have a conversation with you to see, to take you up on your speaking so that you can help us see how we can change the church and the city and systems within it to make it the world a better place.
I would love, my email address is kmason.
Okay.
At the letter J, J-A-Y,
yeah,
.cuny.edu. Love to do it. So it's interesting you talk about the church. One of the things, and I know you're trying to end this, Andy. One of my the young folks that I embraced through the Obama years is over the faith work at Facebook. And she created a series this summer called Faith and Prejudice. And so Brian Stevenson and I were on a panel the third night talking about the justice system and the faith, what the faith community could be doing. So I'm glad to hear that your church is engaged in thinking about what they can do. And I'd love to, but you ought to look up that series, Faith and Prejudice. It was a great series. I learned a lot from watching it.
Well, we have Darren Walker come in and said, everybody's invited. Everything's on Zoom. Everything's online.
What church is it?
Church at the Heavenly Rest. It's an Episcopal church on 90th and 5th by the Guggenheim. And we have Kelly Douglas Brown, who is the Dean of Episcopal Divinity School at Union, interviewing Darren Walker. So we have a lot of great stuff going on. We've had people from the police department, the school system.
Excellent.
The Zoom, everybody's available. But
and I love the president of Union. She's fabulous. We've been
Kelly Douglas Brown. Yeah, we went on a pilgrimage to Atlanta together. She's amazing.
Yeah, great. Love to hear it.
Okay.
So, you know, one of the things that I hope that we leave is hopeful, because we should be hopeful. If you're not hopeful, then we need to talk again, because we can do this. We know how to do this. We just have to commit to doing it. And when I say it's everybody's got to commit to doing something. And as long as you're doing something, it's going to make a difference. It's going to get us through this. And the other side is going to be better. There's no question in my mind about that, because I think that what's been revealed can no longer be hidden. And again, I applaud you all for having this conversation. I applaud you all for letting me say the system is racist without feeling that I'm calling you a racist, and realizing that we've got to fix our systems while we're trying to help the people that we want to see succeed, because we all benefit when we all succeed. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk with you all and have this conversation and to come home to Carolina, even if it's just virtually. I miss you guys.
Karol, thank you again. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to those of you who've joined us from Chapel Hill and from all over the country. This is a really terrific conversation and one we will certainly keep going. Those of you who are here in Chapel Hill, I just wanted to let you know that IAH has been a long-term partner with REI, the Racial Equity Institute, and we do offer trainings here in Hyde Hall when we are able to be here in Hyde Hall. And we anticipate doing that again for the campus community and beyond as much as we can. Ava has compiled the list of books that Karol mentioned in the chat, and we'll also provide those online as well. And we look forward, as always, to continuing the wonderful conversation. Thank you again, Karol. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And thank you as well to the wonderful IAH staff who behind and in front of the scenes who made this happen, particularly Ebony Johnson, Ava Lane, and Sophia Ramos. Have a wonderful day, you all, and we'll leave you with that message of hope. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.